Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. I hope you can hear us. My name is Diana Bonchivaguli, and I'm a senior advisor at USAID's digital finance team, which is in the Innovation, Technology, and Research Hub. Today, we will talk about proven solutions and effective practices about closing the gender digital divide. So the development community has been trying or working on closing the gender digital divide for about 15 years now. And we know solutions do exist. Many have proven and shown promise. Others have shown viability for adaptation and replication for scale. And yet, despite donors and other stakeholders being generally aware of those solutions and the underlying issues, momentum to close the gender digital divide and collective action has been lagging for a variety of reasons. And that's why USAID has been a supporter of CGAP for many years. They're one of the thought leaders on closing the gender gap in financial inclusion. And that is also why USAID, together with the Gates Foundation, set up the Women in the Digital Economy Fund, which we call YDEF. Its purpose is not only to accelerate evidence-based solutions through financial and technical support, but also to build partnerships and aligned public, private, and civil society actors to collectively advance closing the gender digital divide. And really the purpose there is not only to provide that acceleration, but also share resources and knowledge to do that. And we have set up a community of practice, which is called the Women Digital Economy Community of Practice, which is growing, and we all welcome you to join it. You can just look it up and let us know if you're interested in doing so. To date, we have brought in additional funders to YDEF, like Microsoft, Reliance Foundation, the UPS Foundation, and COICA, and we have over 50 organizations that have made aligned commitments totaling over $1 billion to close the gender digital divide. However, today we'll talk about what we know has worked, where to find relevant resources in order to more effectively and efficiently close the gender digital divide together. And I have two speakers that have been working on doing exactly that for quite some time, and I'm really delighted to introduce Gayatri Vikram Murthy. She is a senior financial sector specialist at CGAP, and Christian Penotti, who is the managing director for the Women in the Digital Economy Fund at CARE. I would like to pass it on to you, Gayatri, first, and Christian, just to give us a little bit of background on who you are, and then we'll start with questions. Thank you.
Thank you. I am CGAP's gender lead and focus on kind of consolidating all of the insights around women and women's financial inclusion at CGAP. My background is basically around fintech and fintech solutions for low-income communities, but I've also done a lot of work in customer research. So I bring both those lenses to my work, and I'm based in Washington, D.C. Very nice to be here.
Thanks, Gayatri. Christian? I think you're on mute.
There's always something. Apologies. Thanks so much. Really happy to be here. Christian Penotti. I'm the managing director or chief of party in USAID parlance on the Women in the Digital Economy Fund. My background is really very much in the economic development space. So I've worked on supporting access to finance, supporting entrepreneurship, a significant amount of work in the past in the food security space, and really in all of those kept, abutting against access to technology and the interface with the internet and the possibilities and challenges there. And so over the past few years, I've really been focused on thinking about and working towards moving the needle on the digital divide.
Thanks, Christian. We'll begin with our first question, and we'll start with the barriers. Before we offer solutions, let's talk a little bit about barriers. What can you tell us? What are the barriers, the main ones that we see for women to accessing and meaningfully engaging with the digital economy? And maybe we can start with Christian first.
Yeah, happy to. So I think obviously there's a plethora of challenges we face here. And I think we often hear about, 4 or 5 key barriers. Accessibility. Are people able to access devices and network affordability. Are people able to afford not only devices, but also data and power, actually energy to charge devices? Relevant content, a significant proportion of online content is exclusively in English. And so we just have this huge gap in terms of accessible content, in terms of languages, but also in terms of distribution, media, low literacy populations, people who can't read potentially, how are they able to access the internet and access the solutions that they're looking for? Significantly around privacy and security, I think the GSMA has found that once people understand, know about the internet, maybe have a device, privacy, safety, and security are some of the major constraints that people grapple with. And then skills, and I would say skills and confidence. Digital skills and the confidence to navigate these solutions. We see consistently, again, that when people do get online, men and women may use the internet at relatively similar rates, but women tend to use it for fewer use cases. And so they're not necessarily doing as many things and exploring sort of the range of options there as much. So those, I think, are some of sort of like the technology barriers, and they may affect men and women, though women disproportionately. But we also, kind of all know that women and girls face a pervasive set of social norms and structural barriers that don't necessarily impact men and boys in the same way. And that manifests in all sorts of ways. Women who do get online are, disproportionately subject to online gender-based violence and harassment. Women in their homes and their communities are often dissuaded or discouraged from getting online at all. And we see routine instances of intra-household domestic gender-based violence or social pressure to keep women offline. Lots of fears about women are going online and basically cheating on their husbands and things like that. One of the advisors on the Women in the Digital Economy Fund laid this out once really well, and then sort of ended it by saying, but for the peace in her home, she stays offline. And so I think there's a lot that we have to be doing in that space as well when we think about how do we really create opportunities. So that's a big piece of the puzzle.
Thanks, Christian. There may be some technical issues. I'm just checking. We got a message about the live stream being cut, but I'm hoping it works.
Maybe I can also try to troubleshoot.
Oh, it's all good. Okay, we're good. Great.
Okay.
Thank you, Christian. And Gayatri, over to you.
Yeah, so actually, I'd like to underline something Christian brought up regarding gender and social norms. I think that's one of the areas of, understanding and research that us as a sector are really beginning to see play a role in women's financial inclusion. So like Christian mentioned, I think the way gender norms can be persistent in a particular area or region can really determine how women are expected to interact with the financial system and can or cannot access particular kinds of financial services. But I think I'd like to go one step forward and say one of the barriers we must explore as a sector is to understand how gender norms affects the financial system itself. So it's not just what the women are facing or experiencing as themselves or individuals, but it's how the system may treat them. And I think that requires a lot of work going forward around how marketing materials are designed, how credit assessments are created, what kinds of products are offered to what kinds of segments, etc. Another big area, I think, for financial inclusion relates to the availability of really high-level, good gender disaggregated data. With that, without having the data on how women can and cannot access, how they can and cannot use financial services, we actually don't know what's going wrong in many cases, not at a company level and even at a national level. We don't understand how to segment women better and to create differentiated kind of services. So all of these can be better helped if we had good supply-side gender disaggregated data. And there's work, I think, that's been happening around that from many of us. Finally, I think just a tactical point, in terms of barriers, I think one thing that we as a sector can improve on is to address the scalability of our interventions. A lot of times as financial inclusion and women's financial inclusion actors, we create solutions or we're part of innovations that really work in a region or a subgroup. but often don't find the scale and replicability they deserve. And therefore, their impact on overall women's inclusion is unknown. So I think that's where I would end by the biggest barriers I see.
Thanks, Gayatri. And for the audience, if you have any questions, please pop them in the chat, and we'll try and answer them at the end. Thanks for the barriers. So now we can move on to solutions. Can you give us any examples of what has worked to close the gender digital divide in the digital economy, and if there are any resources, where can people find those to point us to those? And let's start with Gayatri this time.
Yeah, so I think the way in which women's financial inclusion initiatives have worked well is when they're really embedded in the realities of women's lives, right? So one example that really comes across in many parts of the world is financial services that are embedded within VSLAs or savings groups, or what India calls self-help groups, right? So what happens there is you're leveraging a system or a way of the way women come together to actually build on and provide services, provide training, provide business skills, etc. So I think various initiatives across the world have focused on that. I think another thing that's worked really well is mass scale kind of payment systems aimed at women. So whether those are like government payment programs that target women beneficiaries, or the great example we have in Bangladesh of wage-based payments. So I think whether you look across the world, there are many great examples of using big payment systems and big beneficiary programs to help women take that first step. So I think we have a lot of good examples of these kind of first steps. I think what we need now is more entrenched, more kind of high-level services beyond payments, right? So looking at embedded finance, maybe in areas like gig work, where women are increasingly joining the workforce, and areas like that which are less explored. We cannot stop at large payments for women. I think we need more than that.
Thank you. Christian, you're on mute again.
All right, I'm going to stop muting. This is the risk of having a dog and doing webinars. But I'm going to pick up in a minute on the SHG self-help group, savings group bit. But maybe just before jumping into that, I think something Gayatri mentioned in her last response about looking for scalable solutions and really thinking about how do we get to sustainability and scale, which I do think it's an ongoing challenge, honestly, in the digital inclusion space as well. And one of the places where there's perhaps a lot to be gained by, I think, closing some of the gap between like financial inclusion and digital inclusion, or ICT for D. But I mentioned, in terms of that range of barriers, I think what we've seen is where you can have more success is by trying to tackle multiple barriers kind of in a coordinated way. And so we've seen, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars, right, that have gone into initiatives to try to address one or another of these constraints, whether it's digital skills training campaigns or affordability campaigns or infrastructure investment. And what we find when we actually sit down and try to understand what it feels like when we use sort of human-centered design and women-centered design and sit and try to understand what does this feel like from their perspective, it's not like we can solve one of these problems and the other things can happen later, right? It's kind of like she's facing all of these constraints in real time. And I think we can all appreciate what that's like, right? And so solutions that are actually coming together and bringing solutions to multiple pieces of this in a way that works for her, I think is where we're seeing more success and progress. So a couple of examples. One, I would just say, to your point about resources, I'm incredibly sort of grateful to have the opportunity to work on the Women in the Digital Economy Fund. And we recently announced a list of 20 semifinalists, which are amazing organizations all over the world that are doing exactly that. So I would encourage folks to check that out. I won't speak to all 20 of them, but just a couple of illustrations. So an organization called Hasty in Nigeria is taking a combined approach to building digital skills plus entrepreneurship plus access to finance. Kick2Net in Kenya combines device affordability interventions and digital skills building for women in rural communities across the country. Basabali in Indonesia is working to build digital skills build young people's confidence and young women's confidence and locally accessible content, right? So they use this sort of hackathon model to build locally accessible content, but it's also solving a number of these other constraints, right? It's demystifying, it's creating more of a sense of a norm that this is things that women and girls get involved in, right? That this isn't sort of exclusively the domain of men. So I think where we see interventions that are solving for multiple of these barriers at once, we're seeing more success. And it often does cut across those lines of, if you're doing entrepreneurship and all you do is get her a phone, she's not going to grow her business, right? We know that. We know there are other constraints. And so maybe just two examples from within CARE's broader work. One is exactly to Gayatri's point, working with savings groups. And so we've been working with savings groups across East Africa to engage them as an entry point and a platform to get women and girls online. And some of the beauty there is that not every member needs to have a device. Not every member needs to build all the skills necessarily. They can learn from one another and they can kind of move at their own pace within the group in terms of digital adoption. I think similar to what we've seen in financial services, right? So that's been really successful and exciting. And another example is with growth-oriented entrepreneurs. Been working with MasterCard Center for Inclusive Growth for a number of years in multiple countries at this point. On a holistic model, and it addresses digital skills building. So this is more, these women are already running a business. They already have, they're already online in some form, but they're deepening their use in terms of marketing, in terms of digital financial services, in terms of, engaging with customers. At the same time, building skills on the business side and creating space within their homes and the social space, engaging men and boys to pick up more of the household labor, to pick up, to champion their wives and mothers as entrepreneurs, and to support them in doing that. So bringing those pieces together has been really, really powerful. And I think as we think about how do we get solutions at scale, honestly, that remains one of the big challenges, right? Is everything works at a certain scale, but how do we get it to national scale? How do we truly close the digital divide at global scale remains a challenge.
Thanks, Christian. So I'm hearing addressing several barriers at once is usually what works. So don't address just one, but try to have more holistic approach. Speak her language in marketing materials, for example. Meet her where she is, so in her community. Help women learn from each other. The other one is, so it's more of a question, I guess. What is the equivalent of payments at scale, like national payments or wage payment digitization? What is the equivalent for the gender digital divide, I wonder? Maybe something for us to ponder. And when Gayatri mentioned that there are opportunities for embedded finance / payments for gig work. And that would be something very interesting to see, since we're talking about the digital economy. And you need payments and you need people to be able to work. So some questions going forward for us to think about. One more question before we can answer some of the audience's questions. The last question for me would be, how can the private sector collaborate with government, civil society, and any other stakeholders to develop and scale those proven solutions to close the gender digital divide? And any best practices for multi-stakeholder partnerships? You are engaged in such partnerships both, so would love to hear your thoughts. We can start with Gayatri. Ladies first.
Thank you. So, I want to pick up on one point you're mentioning around embedded finance. I think that's a great direction for us to look forward. And that will mean that the financial system, banks, fintechs, etc., will need to find new kinds of partners, which might be platforms, but they also might be large groups of people, large organizations that bring women together, right? It could be employment groups, worker groups, commerce platforms. We need to kind of see these partnerships not just happen, but also begin to scale and normalize. Like right now, we're a very early stage of the financial system working with other kinds of systems and platforms. So I think that is something where we need to find those partnerships and we need to demonstrate how they work. I've done some work around this in the gig work that we at CGAP did a few years ago. And the space is very new and nascent and certainly not ready for scale for women. But I think that's one direction to think about. I think another thing that I think of is when it comes to financial institutions and governments is we actually have really good examples here already. For instance, if you think about large scale programs for opening bank accounts, which I think India has been a kind of foremost example on, you see that perhaps in the beginning, the government has to do a very heavy push and kind of create these systems and infrastructures and account ownership. But then over time, if the right conditions exist, the innovators can come in and kind of build on top of those foundations. And to some extent, we see that happening at scale even, but perhaps not completely for the women and women's segment. So that's another area to think of. Where can government demonstrate so that private sector then comes in and builds off of? Supply side gender disaggregated data is a great place for that. I think a great idea for that to happen. So the more governments and central banks can think about that, I think it can be a great way to engage, to have an engagement between public sector and private sector. In the end, the last thing I'll say is, I think women's financial inclusion needs movement level programming. Like, it's not enough to say a product here, women are a segment that we're focusing on. I think women's financial inclusion demands today that we really look at national level kind of big agendas that at the highest levels of markets are prioritized. So that could mean national level coalitions. It could mean social and cultural programming that focuses on women's inclusion to really elevate the point. And I think that's what at CGAP we're trying to look at through kind of country approaches to closing the gender gap. Where can we create country level programs which bring together various multi-stakeholders, quite like similar to YDEF, and would hope to do things in that area together. So I think we need that kind of level of attention on this issue, because otherwise we're just looking at small solutions that are good to read about in case studies, but we don't see that scale and impact that we're all, I think, so hungry for. So over to Christian.
Thanks, Gayatri. And we actually didn't coordinate responses, but I think we may end up in a similar place here. But yeah, so I think a couple points on what do we need and what are the opportunities for partnership. I would reinforce, I think, Gayatri's point about public sector leadership, and really having a proactive government and a coordinated kind of all of government approach, I think is an incredibly powerful driver and what's needed in this moment. When we think about sort of the history of the gap, the financial inclusion gap and kind of how that went for a really long time, we had good gains, and then it's sort of the closer you get to zero, the harder it is to close the gap, right? And I think we're seeing a very similar corollary on digital inclusion. We've seen, over the past 5 or 6 years, we were great progress, down to 25%, down to 15%. COVID happened, that number went back up, right? And now we're back, we're going in the right direction again, but we're back to where we were in 2020. And it's just stubbornly persistent, right? So I think public sector leadership there is key. And we did also, the YDEF team just put out a report on public sector initiatives and public sector leadership and examples. So that's something folks can definitely go check out. We'll make sure the website is available. But I do, not to kind of, I think, parrot, Gayatri, what you're saying, but I feel like we have the same thing. YDEF will, within a few weeks, put out, an amazing compendium of effective practices to close the gender digital divide. And they're wonderful case studies, and they're doing phenomenal work, and there's promise for scale in all of them. The puzzle is, what is the mechanism? How do we actually help those good ideas get to national scale? And I do think it's going to take more of a coordinated national level effort. I think about things like the FSD network, right? And what those institutions were intended to do, and what a number of them have been really successful in doing in terms of facilitating systemic change over time on inclusive financial systems. I feel like we need a similar kind of approach moving forward if we're going to move the needle on digital inclusion. And really, we talk a lot about the gender digital divide, but the reality is there's also a digital divide, right? It's not like 100% of men are online and 50% of women. We have tremendous digital inclusion gaps across urban, rural, across high income, low income. And, so we've got all these intersecting constraints. And I think that really demands strong public sector leadership for sure, but also facilitated approaches that are looking at this at national scale and looking at how do we invest resources and move in a direction that gets us inclusive, meaningful access and use for all.
Thanks, Christian. And also, yes, it's not only access. There is
yep. Sorry, go ahead. 100%.
Well, we have about 5 minutes. So just briefly about resources, because we promised you resources. Gayatri, they have a lot of resources on CGAP's website, as well as on the inequity website. And Christian mentioned a report that came out from YDEF on the advocacy part and some solutions there. And then there is another report that's coming out very soon. So keep an eye on the YDEF website, and then everybody knows about CGAP, of course, but these are two good places for resources. We have 5 minutes, and I see a few questions here. Gayatri, the first one is for you. I'll read it so everybody knows what we're talking about. Are there solutions you have seen that are beginning to address gender norms that affect the way financial services are designed? And in these, what are some of the drivers of success?
So I think there are a few examples. It's not necessarily a wide area of experimentation yet, because I think there is a bit of a kind of change management that must happen, right? Either within institutions or at the national level. First, we must be able to see the effects of norms. I think that's the first step. And often that is where we are still stuck at as an industry. We're just even beginning to see the differentiated effects. I think one really good example that comes to mind is the example of women financial agents, right? Both seen in South Asia and parts of sub-Saharan Africa to differing levels of success. But what you have there is an understanding that women's mobility and time and safety are big issues in many parts of the world. And therefore, women may not be able to, like men, access banking services at a bank branch. And that might work for agents at large, but women agents might have a particular effect with women customers. And there might be a greater, and some evidence even shows that there's a greater exchange, not just of information, but even knowledge. So women agents are able to better exchange knowledge with women customers about how do you actually use systems, what's best for them, etc., etc. The issue with this is how, again, it's the same issue that we've been discussing, is how do you scale something like this? So how do you pay those women agents the right kind of money? How do you ensure their own safety, their own mobility? So those issues are where we're stuck at in that space, right? So women agents exist, but to create a kind of scalable workforce of women agents has been a big issue wherever these things have been tried. So that, I think, is a good illustration of how this stuff works, right? First, you understand the norms at play. You design a solution that may not necessarily eliminate the gender norm, because that's a very large social project, but at least try to circumvent them, to work around them or to work with them in the picture. And then how do you scale something like that? How do you make that solution a default that organizations don't even necessarily question? So I think that third step, we have very little to show. And even if particular institutions or banks may put in place certain effects, we don't know enough about how they then succeed so that other banks replicate, So I think that's the big issue when it comes to norms and norms-based, norms-informed financial services.
Thanks, Gayatri. I think we're running out of time, and people are probably running to the next session. But I just want to thank you all for being here. Thank you, Gayatri and Christian, and thanks to the audience for joining us today. We really appreciate it. And if you want to chat with us, you know where to find us. We can, I guess we could share our emails here, but you can find us on LinkedIn. We're happy to chat with everybody. Thanks again, and enjoy the rest of the conference. Have a good day, evening. Thank you, guys.
Thank you so much.
Thanks so much.
I love it. Punctual.
Thanks, everyone.